when countless innocent people are facing a massacre, and when we have the ability to prevent it, the United States cannot just look away. That's not who we are. We're Americans. We act. We lead.
Less than 3 years after declaring the Iraq War over, President Obama justifies the U.S. going back in, at least to block ISIS from taking over more territory. And it's time now for our Sunday group, syndicated columnist George Will, Jackie Kucinich of the Washington Post, radio talk show host Laura Ingraham, and Ron Fournier from the National Journal. George, what do you think of the air campaign that the president launched this week? And to pick up on the phrase he used there, is this a case of America acting and leading?
Well, he's now the fourth consecutive U.S. president to engage militarily with Iraq, and this time the question is, what is the mission? If the mission is simply to protect the Kurds and others, then that's one thing. We are actually obligated under the Genocide Convention, which is right here, and which Ronald Reagan signed the implementation legislation of in 1988. It says genocide is a crime under international law which they, the signatories, undertake to prevent and to punish. So there's this kind of statutory reason for this. On the other hand, that seems to concede the advances that ISIL has made. That is, there's no talk really about getting rid of their conquest of territory up there. I don't know about you, I was very struck by Jack Keane saying that ISIL is now attacking south of Baghdad. Now that means they've got them surrounded. And it means, A, what's left of the Iraqi state. The president says much depends on what we do on there being an inclusive government in Baghdad. And while he's engineering an inclusive government in Baghdad, the writ of that Baghdad government doesn't seem to run much beyond the suburbs of Baghdad.
We asked you for questions for the panel, and we got this on Facebook from Bruce Stultz. He writes, I'm happy that we are helping those on the mountain, but to think that limited military strikes are going to make a difference is silly. You go in to win or don't go in at all. Jackie, I mean, that seems to be, and we heard this in the debate between Senators Cardin and Senator Graham, what's our mission there? Is it too much? Is it too little? How do you answer, Bruce?
I think it's striking that there's no end date to these strikes. That the president, it was kind of vague, and I think that was on purpose, so they could potentially expand this later. I also think Benghazi is looming very large here. I think particularly with the American consulate in Erbil. If that falls, then they have a humanitarian crisis that's even bigger, and the problem of getting personnel out. So there are a lot of things that it makes sense what their administration is doing right now. As far as putting boots on the ground, the president's hand was forced even starting these airstrikes, I think. I don't think he really wanted to go into Iraq again. So this is a first step. We'll see what happens.
Well, Laura, it was clear to anybody who was watching on Thursday night that this president really didn't want to do what he was doing, really didn't want to go back into a combat situation, even from the air, in Iraq, wasn't happy about doing it, and was trying to come up with a very carefully calibrated, limited policy. How did he do?
I think it's really hard. I don't think you can judge how he did right now. I mean, we're almost in an impossible situation, right? The American people really have no appetite for America to re-engage. They didn't want us to go into Syria. Obama did want to go into Syria. That red line was crossed. We couldn't go in. The American people said no. The British people said no. After Iraq and Afghanistan, our own country, middle class struggling, people are, what are we going to do? What are we going to accomplish? So I think he's reacting to that, but he also, as the Washington Post pointed out yesterday, he's now, I think, reluctantly seeing the perils of inaction. If we do nothing here, then what? I mean, let's say Iraq does fall, which I think is a possibility. Iraq may fall if indeed there are no boots on the ground, not going to happen, can't happen. That's very empowering to ISIL, right? If they know American troops are not going to be on the ground at all, and I'm not saying I want them there, then they know they get an artillery position hit, as they did yesterday, and then they flood back in, which is what happened yesterday. They have that hydroelectric dam right now. If ISIL decides to flood much of southern Baghdad, can reach all the way to Baghdad, that in and of itself would be devastating. And we should also remember about 3 million Christians lived in Iraq in peace. We're talking about the Yazidis. They need help, they're desperate in need of help. Christians have been suffering in Iraq for several years now. And I think our government, even the Bush government, hasn't done enough to protect those religious minorities as well. So this inattention to what's happening on the ground in Iraq has been going on for some time. I don't know if there's a good solution right now, which is a horrible thing to say for the United States of America.
Ron, as I pointed out with General Keane, we are literally hitting one artillery piece, one convoy at a time. Does it make sense to have such a limited mission, such a limited role, or should we either be doing more or should we either be doing less?
I don't know. I think we're missing the big question here. First, it's hard to admit this, but our country was not honest about how it got into Iraq and not smart about how it got out of Iraq. We can't do anything about the former, so let's talk about the latter. I think, as you say, the president is doing what most of the Americans want right now, something very limited. Let's save those people on the mountain. Let's save our people on the ground, something that's very strategic. The problem is, this is a very ruthless, strategic, well-funded group of terrorists. I even hate to say the word group, of terrorists.
It's a state.
A state.
It's got a government, it's got an army.
Its only mission is to take us out. We are going to get hit. They are coming after us. And we are going to get hit if we don't figure out how to stop them. So short term, yes, the president's doing fine. Long term, look, this is a president who underestimated ISA. He called them JV. He underestimated what was going to happen after Libya. He said that in the New York Times article. He underestimated Putin. He underestimated several other areas. He's been the commander-in-chief or the underestimator-in-chief. So I don't want him to underestimate. We can't afford the president to underestimate this threat. I also don't want him to overreact. We've done that before, and it kind of got us into this mess. So you're right. It's an awfully tough thing to do. I wish I was more confident that the president really understood the threat to our homeland, though.
You heard Lindsey Graham, George. How do you respond to him when he says, look, forget about political reconciliation in Baghdad. We have our own national security interest, and the fact is if you establish this caliphate, and that's what they say they are, they don't call themselves ISIS or ISIL anymore. They call themselves the Islamic State. They say they've already created a state. If you establish that in the heart of the Middle East, we are going to bemoan that for decades, the way that we bemoaned what happened with al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
We have fought for 13 years, the longest war in our history in Afghanistan. Why? Because we said it is in our national interest not to have a large area that is a safe haven in which terrorists can plot attacks against us. Iraq now, after 8 years of war in Iraq, 2001 to 2011, is becoming exactly what we went into Afghanistan to prevent. Remember Colin Powell's pottery barn rule? If you break it, you own it. We've broken 2 states in the Middle East. We broke, by our policy, the state of Libya. We broke, by our policy, the state in Iraq. And we own the rubble.
So when we own the rubble, does that mean we have responsibility for fixing it?
We know we have a responsibility to learn the lesson at long last that we can't fix states like this.
Let me put it this way. 13 years ago, almost exactly to this day, President Bush got a memo saying al-Qaeda wants to attack America. We have just gotten the memo. And that's also what's happening right now. This is the memo about the next attack.
And we learned today, more details about how al-Qaeda is kind of disintegrating right into the Islamic State. So al-Qaeda has become the Islamic State. So George is right. I think we try to do all these things in Iraq. Now Iraq is worse off. I hate to say that, but Iraq is worse than before we went into Iraq. Christians are gone. There's no sense of order at all. Saddam Hussein is gone. That's a good thing. But what's left? A more emboldened Islamic State, not contained, apparently, even by U.S. airstrikes.
All right. We have to take a break here.